Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the performance of number 44, defenseman Marc-Edouard Vlasic. And Vlasic had signed a pretty long-term extension back in the offseason of 2017 at the same time as Martin Jones signed his extension, and as such, Vlasic was in the first year of said contract this past season, and the contract being worth $7 million over 8 years, $7 million per year over 8 years, and Vlasic is now on the wrong side of 30, and so it was a bit of a worry whether or not Vlasic would fall off at some point and when that would be. However, you could certainly quell those worries by saying that Vlasic doesn't necessarily play the style of game that would tend to falling off rather soon at like 34 or something like that. That might be happening to more speedy type of defensemen, more physical type of defensemen that rely on an elite offensive game, but Vlasic is much more of a cerebral kind of guy, and so you wouldn't expect him to have as steep of a fall off at, let's say, age 34, 35 as you might expect from other defensemen. But it was still quite worrying this season when Vlasic put up one of his worst defensive seasons of memory. Now, his frequent pairings during the regular season at the very least, was him with Braun, which is his usual pairing. However, we saw a few alterations to that, of course, with the addition of Erik Karlsson. It was expected that Vlasic and Karlsson could make up likely the best defensive pairing in the NHL, but for some reason that never seemed to work out. Whenever Vlasic and Karlsson were together, they both seemed to play like headless chickens, so it seemed as though Vlasic just stayed with Braun for the majority of the regular season. But in the playoffs, due to the injury of Radim Shemek, they ended up putting Vlasic and Burns together, creating what maybe was at that point the best defensive pairing in the NHL, because it was like magic when those two players were together. They both made each other better. But starting off with the regular season, 72 games played for Vlasic, as he did miss a good chunk due to injury. 3 goals and 22 assists for 25 points. So actually not all that bad offensively for Marc-Edouard Vlasic, but he was a -6, which was certainly not great. That was near the bottom of the team. Only ahead of Justin Braun, his usual defensive partner, who was far behind that, but I'll of course get to that in Justin Braun's video. His penalty minutes actually were only 10. Now, of course, Vlasic in the previous year, the 17-18 season, it was sort of like touted how, he doesn't have many minor penalty minutes, as he, racked up a couple misconducts. This season, there were no misconducts or anything like that, but he did have 5 minors, which for most defensemen is very, very good, and for Vlasic is very, very good. So it's nice to see that he's still not taking any sort of stick infractions and hookings and trippings and all of the things like that, as those are normally penalties given to players who have to take those because they are out of position. For the time on ice, 21 minutes and 3 seconds, a pretty solid amount for a defenseman like Vlasic, who doesn't really get too much power play time. A lot of it is shorthanded, as well as a good chunk of it being even strength. He was actually 4th for a defenseman on even strength, however, as he found himself, of course, behind Burns and Karlsson, but also behind Justin Braun, surprisingly. So the regular season didn't go particularly well for Vlasic, but where he really turned it on was in the playoffs. As I said, he was placed with Burns for about 70% of the time he was on at even strength, and in the 18 games he played, he had 3 goals, 5 assists, and 8 points. Now, he only played 18 games, and the 2 games he missed were actually games 3 and 4 against the Golden Knights, and game 2 against the Golden Knights was a game he only actually played a few minutes in before leaving due to injury. And what were the 3 worst games of the playoffs for the San Jose Sharks? Well, you could likely say games 2, 3, and 4 against the Golden Knights. Is there some sort of correlation between Vlasic not playing full games and the Sharks playing completely horrible? Potentially. Could the Sharks have won those games if Vlasic had played the full time? Potentially. Nothing can actually be proven, but it does go to show how important Vlasic was in the playoffs for the Sharks. His plus-minus was a +6, which was +3 higher than anybody else on the team. I believe Timo Meier was the closest with +3, so it shows, especially for a player like Vlasic, who was getting the toughest minutes against the top competition, against the Golden Knights, whether that be the Stone line or the Marchessault line, against the Colorado Avalanche, whether that be the McKinnon line, which is extremely impressive to have been able to shut down pretty well, as well as St. Louis, that could be the Tarasenko line. And so the fact that Vlasic was a +6 definitely goes to show how well he performed during the playoffs. He had only 4 penalty minutes, which is just 2 minors, which certainly isn't bad, as well as 23 minutes and 33 seconds of time on ice, something that could have even been higher if it wasn't somewhat skewed due to the fact that he only did get to play a few minutes back in that Game 2 against the Golden Knights where he left early due to injury. So Vlasic was relied on heavily in the playoffs thanks to him playing with Burns, which ended up being the top pairing, and he performed extremely well. So for his grades, the first quarter gave him a B-. The second quarter was very, very bad, actually, with a C-. His third quarter was back to being decent with a B-, and his fourth quarter actually ended quite strong. He was one of the few defensemen who actually was still going strong at the end of the season, where the Sharks mostly fell off, and he got a B+. And then in the playoffs, I ended up giving him an A. Now, I didn't give any player this season, any quarter or in the playoffs, an A+, but if there was a player who actually came at, very close to that, it probably was Vlasic's performance in the playoffs. It was just that superb, that stellar, that I was almost there to giving him the A+. I felt like it wouldn't be that fair to some other players who maybe should have gotten an A+ at some point during the regular season or in the playoffs, so I ended up going with an A, but for all intents and purposes, it was basically an A+. And so for the final grade, while the regular season wasn't great, the playoffs were so good for Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and such a nice sign moving into the next season that this wasn't some sort of fall off type of season. This wasn't Vlasic settling into a new contract and just lazing around and not really playing that well. The playoffs really give hope for the next 7 years of this contract, and as such, the final grade for him ends up being a rather solid grade of a B for the season. Class dismissed.